afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Yes. Okay, I was criticized earlier. This is my do-over. So thank you. Welcome to our one of our highlights of our 2023 Black History Now Cultural Heritage Series programs celebrating Black History Month. Our presentation today, Harriet Tubman, freedom fighter, conductor, nurse, soldier, and spy, by Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, a history professor at Norfolk State University, is the first of a three-part scholarly series we have titled Pathways to Resistance and Freedom. Our next presentation on February 18th will feature Dr. Timothy Walker, history professor at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, and will be presented as part of the opening of our traveling exhibit, Sailing to Freedom, Maritime Dimensions of the Underground Railroad at the Portsmouth Art and Cultural Center, which is just a block away. I'm sure most of you know where that is. This exhibit, originally installed at the New Bedford Whaling Museum in Massachusetts, was co-curated by Dr. Walker, and we will have a reception with that opening. So if you come to that presentation, please join us for that reception at the Art and Cultural Center. Our final presentation is on February 25th, and it's titled The Archaeology of a Secret World in the Great Dismal Swamp by Dr. Daniel Sayers from American University in Washington, D.C. We do have these nice little postcards. If you don't have one, these are available to you outside and at the front desk of our Welcome Center that will give you a little more information on the presentations. Now let me tell you a little bit about our featured speaker today. Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, a Norfolk, Virginia native, received her BA from the University of Virginia and her PhD from the College of William and Mary. Since that time, she has focused much of her research and writing on the history of African Americans in Virginia. She is the interim dean of the College of Liberal Arts, a professor of history, and the director of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for African Diasporic Studies at Norfolk State University. That's a big title. It's an important job, absolutely. Her publications have appeared in edited books and major biographical series such as the Dictionary of Virginia Biography and the American Middle Class, an Economic Encyclopedia of Progress and Poverty. Her most recent book, Virginia Waterways and the Underground Railroad, is the first to examine the story of freedom seekers in Virginia. She has also authored an African American history of the Civil War in Hampton Roads, co-authored a Black America series on Portsmouth, and also authored Hampton Roads Remembering Our Schools, as well as co-editing Voices from Within the Veil, African Americans and the Experience of Democracy. She serves on the boards of the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation, the Virginia Law Foundation, the 2019 Commemoration Commission, Historical Commission of the Supreme Court of Virginia, and the Norfolk Sister City Association, as well as WHRO, which is our PBS affiliate. She has also appeared on a number of national programs, including the Library of Congress Clue Center Symposium on 1619's Cultural Exchange, which was broadcast on C-SPAN, Talk of the Nation, which I'm sure many of you know, and also Tavis Smiley presents the State of the Black Union 2007 on Jamestown. Other programs include the History Channel documentary on race, slavery, and the Civil War, and C-SPAN when it filmed the 2010 Virginia Sesquicentennial, thank you, conference at NSU entitled Race, Slavery, and the Civil War, the tough stuff of American history. So as you can see, we're very honored to have such an accomplished scholar with us today. She will do the presentation. We will have about 15 minutes for questions afterwards. And then I do want to note that we are doing a book signing afterwards in our Welcome Center. So you can pick up a book there and have it autographed by Dr. Newby-Alexander. And for those of you who filled out the information up front for the raffle, we will actually have Dr. Newby-Alexander select the recipient of the book that we will gift you, and you can have that autographed here. So without further ado, let me present Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander.
Thank you so much for that gracious introduction. Can everyone hear me? Okay, I occasionally will put on my outside voice, and so just let me know if it's too little, too low, or too high. I want to talk about an extraordinary woman. Someone in which there's a lot of mythology circulating around her. Because her life was so big, it lends itself to so many myths, so many stereotypes, but in the middle of that, so many truths. Imagine the 19th century in America, when even free people of color did not have any rights. Imagine in that period, an enslaved woman was not only able to gain her freedom, but she made sure that she created a pathway and actually led people 19 times to freedom. Hundreds of people, including her brothers and sisters, her nieces and nephews, as well as people that she really didn't know. And she traveled not just by foot, but on the waterways, those waterways that are so much a part of our world here in Hampton Roads. And of course, we always curse the waterways when we have to go through the, bridge, tunnels, and all of that. But those waterways is the pathway that many people took from this area to freedom. An important pathway. For Harriet Tubman, who was born in Dorchester County, Maryland, in the 1820s, there are estimates that maybe it was 1822. And you may ask the question, why don't they know? Why isn't it in the records? Because it wasn't that important to the owners. They fudged the ages of a lot of their enslaved people, whether fudging it to be younger because they wanted more money for them. They were trying to say that they were much younger than they were, or they fudged the age to make them older so that they could sell them to work in the fields or or hire them out to work in the households. Harriet Tubman found herself working as a maid at the age of 5. She didn't know how to clean, how to take care of children, and because of that, she was brutally beaten. But she survived. There was something about what was inside of her that kept her going. She was originally named Arminta, or Minty. She changed her name to Harriet in honor of her mother, who, along with her father, became free blacks. They were originally enslaved. But her father, Ben, was able to eventually gain his freedom and then purchase the freedom of his wife, and wanted to purchase the freedom of his children, but did not have the funds to do so. Harriet was hired out by the Broadus family, and I want to show you just a picture of where the Broadus farm is located today. And there's a marker, and you can actually do a tour of Harriet Tubman's where she worked, so the plantation that she was on. And of course, these two maps are important because it kind of shows you the pathway that she took from Maryland all the way up to, with the map on your right, all the way up to Philadelphia. And she had many different pathways, never took the same route a second time, never. How many of you were able to see the film Harriet? It was in that film that you saw, and I saw the first depiction of how she said she navigated the pathway to freedom. She felt her way through. She took many paths. She even had blackjacks. These were African American men, both free and enslaved, who worked in the maritime industry. Many of them were working at what we call merchant seamen. Today, at that time, they called them seamen. So some of them helped people escape. So she used all kinds of transportation, not just her feet. That was the most dangerous. But she used all types of transportation, wagons, horses, ships, skiffs, flatboats, to get to Philadelphia, and from Philadelphia, the people went to other places, especially to places like New Bedford, Massachusetts, or to Boston, although that became a hot mess by the 1840s, and I'll explain why in just a minute. Some of them actually ended up going to Canada, specifically to the Ontario province of Canada. Toronto was the primary place that many freedom seekers from this area went to because it was a city and it provided lots of opportunities for jobs. Harriet Tubman established a home in St. Catharines in the Ontario province, and a number of people from this area also went there. Well, I think it's important that you understand a little bit about the context of Harriet Tubman and her life. And I wanted to, give you some information about that. She grew up when slavery, and in particular, the business of slavery, was growing in size, expanding in location, and gaining in economic importance. The geographical proximity of Maryland to northern states and the growth of the Underground Railroad really endangered America's first big business, slavery. In fact, in 1860, if you add up all the industries in America, it still did not equal in terms of the economic value the institution of slavery that included people and products and those associated with that industry. This particular chart is important. It juxtaposes 1820 and 1860. And I think I want to direct your attention not only to the numbers in the United States of the enslaved population, but I want you to know that there were still enslaved people in the North. I know the textbooks that you grew up reading said that, they start talking about the South, and that's when they start talking about slavery. Slavery was legal everywhere in this country. It was legal everywhere in this country. And there were enslaved people in Massachusetts. In fact, that's where the first slave law was passed. It also existed in every single colony in this country, and that's why there were laws protecting the industry of slavery that were baked into our first Constitution, called the Articles of Confederation, as well as our 1789 Constitution and some of the major laws that followed, such as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. These laws guaranteed the protection of slavery and slaveholders, not the people who were enslaved. And Virginia was important in so many ways. Virginia had 4 of the first 5 presidents. And it was those presidents who made sure that the institution of slavery was protected and that the rights of the owners were guaranteed. And the laws of Virginia set the standard for the way in which both free and enslaved people would be treated in this country. And so when we talk about systemic racism, that's supposed to be the boogeyman today. But I love stepping into boogies. And I love talking about what people don't want to talk about. I love the movie Encanto. We don't talk about Bruno, so I'm going to talk about Bruno. That's our Bruno. And when we look at this, and you look at this chart, 1820, was when America decided to go full hog into maintaining the institution of slavery. During the American Revolution, there were people who talked about maybe ending it, and that meant sending all the black people back to Africa. Of course, by then there were a lot of white people who had black ancestry, so I don't know what they were talking about. But, you had in 1820, the cotton industry showed promise, so much promise, that it was forcing the expansion westward, which meant that we were waging war against native peoples and taking their land and committing acts of genocide against them. That's the reality of our history. And when we deny that, we deny the pain and the trauma that families have suffered over the many generations, and in some cases continue to suffer because of that history and because of the denial of that history. And I don't care what the state does with the SOLs, I'm still going to fight to teach the truth. And so I want you to look at the numbers of enslaved people in the Upper South. 965,000, and these are general estimates based on the documents that survived. There were a lot of people who weren't recorded. So this is sort of a low number compared to how many people actually were there. In 1820, 965. In 1860, there were still 1.5 million enslaved people in the Upper South. That included Virginia and Maryland, as well as Delaware. There's this perception that Delaware somehow is a northern state, and therefore, no, it was still part of the Upper South. And then, of course, you also had these other states of Kentucky, Missouri, North Carolina, Tennessee, and so forth. Look at Virginia. Look at the numbers in Virginia. 425,000 in 1820, 490,000 in 1860. And Virginia was the primary state in which the majority of people sold in America's domestic slave trade to the South, to the lower South. They came from Virginia. So even with thousands of people being sold every year in Virginia between 1820 and 1860, there were still a lot of enslaved people in Virginia. That is why Virginia was called the slave breeding state, because so many people came from that area. In Maryland, the numbers were dropping. The numbers of free blacks were rising. And this created tremendous fear in the minds of slaveholders, because they felt that, they were of two minds. Maryland's too close to the north, and a lot of people can kind of easily get to a northern state. But on the other side, there are plantations, and those plantations were dominated. I would just want to show you this image. They were dominated by the tobacco industry. Cotton never was king in Virginia or Maryland. It was never king. Tobacco was king. But after 1820, human trafficking became king. So many people were sold through the domestic slave trade, first in Virginia and Maryland. And you can see with these numbers, the numbers in Maryland were going down. So in 1820, you had over 100,000 enslaved people. By 1860, there were 87,000. So there were thousands more being sold, percentage-wise. They had a high rate, being sold out of Maryland and going to the lower South. And these individuals who were sold to the slave markets, especially in Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans, they were then sent to Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, East Texas, Mississippi. That's where slavery was growing tremendously, and look at those figures. For example, Alabama went from 41,000 in 1820 to 435,000. So I want to show you these statistics so you understand the world that Harriet Tubman grew up in. And unlike most people, most people are not going to challenge the status quo because we have a lot of fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of taking risks that may harm us or harm our families. It takes a special person to escape. It takes a special person to fight. It's not as easy as we like to think. And when pressed, how many of you, if you see somebody being abused, will stand up or will you turn away? And so understanding that most people will turn away, most people will kind of keep their heads down and hope that nobody sees them, that's how most people are. But for this woman to decide she was going to stand up, that was an amazing feat. And it probably gives you a real better sense of what will happen later on and how she filled all these different roles. And as many times as she went to the South, as much as she did, nobody knew what she looked like. Imagine, there were no wanted posters with her face on the wanted posters. Nobody, except for those who owned her and her family members, nobody knew what she looked like. She disguised herself constantly. She took different routes. She became a different person each and every time. She was a master in that way. So I wanted you, like I said, to see these statistics. I also wanted you to see this particular map because it is very telling. The red and the purple really shows you the concentrations of people by the time we get from 1820 to 1860. That purple and red line is what is called the Black Belt. That's where the majority of the plantations producing cotton were located. And of course, you can actually look at that and then overlay our interstate system. Well, Harriet Tubman, as some of you know, ended up marrying a free black man named John Tubman. Now, free blacks, you would think, had a lot more rights than enslaved people, and in fact, they at least owned themselves. But at any point in time, a free black person could be arrested. Here in Virginia, and in most places throughout the South, a black person could not testify against a white person in court. And all they needed to do was take your free papers. And here in Virginia, as well as in a lot of states, North and South, they required that all free blacks carry papers, they had to prove that they were free. It was expected that if you were black, you were enslaved. So you had to prove your freedom. We also know that in the 1820s and 30s, there were big kidnapping clubs throughout the country. There was a big one that advertised that they were a kidnapping club in New York City. They put ads out saying that they were a grand kidnapping club. Imagine, you are actually advertising that you're violating the law, and that means there will be no consequences. Here in this area, you had a network of kidnappers who were also slave traders. And that's a whole complicated story in and of itself, because the major slave trader in Norfolk, George Apperson, was actually married, common law marriage, to a free black woman. You can't make this stuff up. That's why when Hollywood makes stuff up, when they make things up, I'm like, why? It's as convoluted as it wants to get if you just look at the history. He also moved up to Richmond and was a partner in what would later be John Lumpkin's slave jail. And John Lumpkin also had a common law wife who he purchased at the age of 11. She had her first child at the age of 13. After the Civil War, he married her just like George Apperson officially married his wife and made both of their wives became the inheritors of their property. George Apperson, when he had his operation, was the wealthiest man in Hampton Roads. So he passed that wealth onto his wife, who was a free black woman. Very strange. But as a free black, she did not have the right, if she was freed in Virginia after 1806, she had to get the legislature, and later after 1815, the local courts to approve her presence here in Virginia. Because Virginia passed a law saying that if you were recently freed after 1806, you had 1 year to get out of the state. And if you didn't get out, you would become a slave again and be sold into the market. Meanwhile, at the same time, most of the northern states passed laws saying if you're black, you can't come in here. This was America's way of trying to force African Americans to leave the country. And that's why we would see an organization called the American Colonization Society that would encourage African Americans, especially free blacks, to leave. And we would see the colony of Liberia formed, and some free blacks, like Norfolk's Joseph Jenkins Roberts and his family, as well as some free blacks from Portsmouth, decided to leave and settle in Liberia. And so many people don't know that they have a Liberian connection, because they don't really know about their family history. Why is that? Because most families have closets, and they put all their little bones in those closets and hide the information from their families until you start getting DNA tests. And then all is revealed, or a lot of questions are raised about who you really are. For free blacks, they had limitations. They couldn't bear arms, they couldn't assemble by themselves, they couldn't learn how to read and write after 1831 because the white leadership decided to use the Nat Turner Revolt as an opportunity to attack free blacks, even though they weren't involved at all in that revolt. They couldn't exercise free speech. They couldn't, as I already said, testify against whites in court. And the hardest thing was trying to protect their families, especially from kidnapping. Solomon Northup talked about kidnapping because he was kidnapped out of Washington, D.C. It was a group of people who were headquartered in Norfolk who organized a lot of kidnappings and then sold them to the New Orleans slave market. And there was a free black from here who was also kidnapped, but his family found out about it and rushed down to New Orleans with his free papers and got him out. But so many others were not so lucky. And so that's who Harriet Tubman married. And so John Tubman felt he had a lot to protect, and he tried to stay the straight and narrow. That's why the majority of people involved in the Underground Railroad in the South were not free blacks. They were enslaved people who operated secretly. Although there were some free blacks in Norfolk who operated out of what was St. Patrick's Church, Catholic Church, and it became St. Mary's, who were involved in the Underground Railroad. Well, I want to talk a little bit about, of course, the main person, Harriet Tubman. When she was very young, she was a young teenager, she suffered a traumatic head injury. She was in a store, and an owner, a slaveholder, threw a 2-pound weight at a man who was his slave. He was angry, but instead he had a horrible, way of throwing, and he hit Harriet Tubman in the head instead of the person he was aiming at. And Harriet Tubman, it took her months and months to recover from that brain trauma. She had epileptic seizures, vertigo. She had all kinds of issues that came as a result of that traumatic head injury. And I'll talk just in a few minutes about that. But one of the things that I suppose it did is surviving that seeing two of her sisters sold through the domestic slave trade, which she knew she would never see them again. Seeing other friends being sold, and then suffering the death of her owner, which for enslaved people always meant separation from their families. And even though she was assured, as the other enslaved people, that she would not be sold, she didn't trust any of them. And for good reason. Because the moment debts came up, an enslaved person was sold. And the younger you were, the better the chance that you were going to be sold. If you were a young woman and you proved that you could have children, you could fetch a higher price than a man who was in his prime, because you could produce babies. And for every child, that was $1 million, as far as the slaveholder was concerned, in today's dollars. So we have, in the 20th century, kind of confused and convoluted our perception of how much money people were making, how much they had in slavery, and I'm talking about those who were the owners. But the reality is it was big business. Now, of course, between 1820 and 1860, we would see the reduction of slaveholders. Except in Virginia, 50% of the Virginia population owned slaves. 50% of the adult population in Virginia owned slaves. We were the anomaly. In the rest of the country, those numbers reduced to 5 to 10% of the population owning slaves, but they didn't own one or two. They owned 100, 400, 10,000, 50,000 enslaved people on numerous plantations. This was America's big business. It's kind of like today, you have very few single-family farmers because it costs $150,000 to purchase one of the smaller pieces of equipment that you need on the farm. So most farmers actually work for corporations that are farmers, as opposed to being a single-family farmer. I wanted you to see this particular ad. Harriet Tubman is actually mentioned in here as Minty. You see Minty, age about 27 years, is of chestnut color. These slave ads love to put colors on black people. I wonder if there was a special person at the newspapers who helped slaveholders to come up with colors. There were light mulattoes, dark mulattoes, medium brown mulattoes, chestnut mulattoes, chestnut colors, dark color. They had colors galore. I just don't even know how they came up with it, but they wanted to tell you what these people look like as much as possible because they didn't have pictures of them. If they had any distinguishing features, scars on their faces or whatever, they would mention that. If they had a limp, they would mention that. But imagine Harriet Tubman, 5 feet tall. So she was an itsy bitsy woman. And nobody told them that the scariest women are the itsy bitsy women. If you want to hurt a woman, do not hurt a small statured woman. No, you shouldn't hurt a woman at all. But if you're going to fight, don't fight a small woman. She will kill you. Usually at night when you're asleep. So what were they doing in this ad? They were offering $100. Do you all know what $100 is in today's dollars? That's tens of thousands of dollars. $100. So this incentivized people to become slave hunters. And there were lots of them on the roads in Maryland and Virginia in particular. Lots of them because of that, because of ads such as that. When she arrived in Philadelphia in 1847, This is the man that she eventually was introduced to, William Still. And I have to tell you, I was jumping up and down when I finally saw him depicted in the film Harriet, because I think that was about the first time. He is a historian's dream. He was a serious pack rat. He never threw anything away. It was in his papers that he preserved the full volume of newspapers, the Provincial Freeman, that was actually written by published by a black woman up in Canada. He kept a journal, and that journal recorded the lives of people who escaped. And he was the first to record Harriet Tubman's presence as a freedom seeker in Philadelphia. And he made sure that his journals and his writings were protected. During the Civil War, he was so afraid that the Confederacy would end up breaching the barriers and invading Philadelphia that he hid all of his papers he buried them in a cemetery to ensure that they would not be lost. Because what was he doing? He was recording who came through his station. What were their names? How old were they? Why did they escape? Who did they leave behind? Where were they going? Because his hope was that his writings would help one day, when freedom actually happened for the nation, that these writings would help others reconnect with their loved ones in the same way that he reconnected with one of his long-lost brothers. His family had escaped before he was born, his parents, but not before his older brother was sold away. And one day when he was, talking with a young man who passed through a station, he found out this man was from where his parents were from. And then he talked more, and then he found out this was his long-lost brother. And so he wanted to make sure that he recorded information about all the people who passed through his station. 795 accounts were included in his book. It helped us to find out about one of Portsmouth's, actually several of Portsmouth's natives who went to New Bedford, Massachusetts. And we found hundreds of their descendants who knew nothing about their story as they escaped from Portsmouth and ended up in New Bedford. Some of those individuals, by the way, who ended up in New Bedford signed up for the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, or some of their sons signed up for the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. And we're able to then mine the records of William Still to find out more about these people who left. Well, I want to talk a little bit more about Harriet Tubman. You know, when she was in Philadelphia, she worked enough to earn money so she could go back to the South, go back to Maryland, and to retrieve family, friends, and others. And she did this constantly, working, earning just enough money to go down there because sometimes there were people to pay. If she used a ship, she had to pay the steward or the ship's captain or somebody aboard that ship for passage for the individuals who were fleeing. Sometimes she had to bribe people. Sometimes she had to pay a little bit of money because people offered them food and refuge. And so she needed money. Sometimes the Vigilance Committee that was part of the Underground Railroad operation in Philadelphia provided her with additional money. But she was used to doing that. And of course, she got to know this large group of abolitionists who were all connected. And these abolitionists, you know, in Philadelphia, you have Chester County, Pennsylvania, which is where Lincoln University is located, and you had the Hosanna Church there. And it's in that church that many of the abolitionists gathered and actually organized and had an operation. They had to find out how to place people who escaped. And for those who wanted to go northward, had to secure passage, whether it was on a train, a ship, wagon, whatever. And then you had other areas, other people like William Lloyd Garrison and Brown, John Brown, Frederick Douglass, all of them knew each other. And she began to have this huge circle of comrades. And they knew about her work and supported her in her work. Well, during the Civil War, she took that feistiness in a similar direction. She worked as a nurse, doing the same thing. She would actually take a block of ice in the morning and go to these hospitals, especially the contraband hospitals, like at Fort Monroe. And she would let that ice begin to melt. And this was, of course, during the winter, but sometimes she would manage to get ice in the summer, let it melt, and she would bathe the wounds of the soldiers. Sometimes it was so bad, she had to bathe their wounds while surrounded by flies. And she would render medicinal assistance, so she knew a lot of herbal remedies. And then at night, she would go back to her cabin or wherever she was encamped and make pies so that she could sell them in exchange for money, or, you know, she would sell them and then she could continue her work. She never got a pension. She never received rations. In fact, even William Seward, the Secretary of State, tried to get a pension for Harriet Tubman and couldn't because of the work that she did. He couldn't get it because she was not a man. And only men were recognized as rendering service during war to the nation. This man, Colonel James Montgomery, I want to tell you this story quickly. I know I'm running quickly out of time. That's kind of my superpower here. Colonel James Montgomery had heard that Harriet Tubman was down in Hilton Head. And while she was rendering this kind of nursing care, she was also doing a lot of spying. And she was spying where the Confederates had their encampments, where they had their battlements, where they had their ships in that area. And so she gained a lot of vital information about the Combahee River area. And he heard about it. And he asked Harriet Tubman. Now imagine, this man, and he's in plain clothes here, but he was a colonel. Imagine a colonel asking a woman who's not in the military, can you lead some troops for me? And he asked her to lead a covert military operation. 3 Union gunboats navigated the river based on the information that she secured. She led 150 African American members of the U.S. 2nd South Carolina Volunteers traveling deep into Confederate territory. Remember now, South Carolina was the first state to secede. And so she led this group in there and orchestrated the largest mass escape of enslaved people. 700 people, men, women, and children, escaped in this raid, led by Harriet Tubman. Imagine. She led the gunboats to specific locations, and she got them to do something that was really important. She had them destroy rice plantations. They were fueling the financial energy of the Confederacy. So they not only took 700 people away, but they destroyed their ability to actually make money from these plantations. So that was Harriet Tubman. Well, a short time later, right after the Civil War was over, she knew this woman. Her name was Sarah Hopkins Bradford. And she was one of the Northern abolitionists that Harriet Tubman engaged quite a bit with. And she was part of these white Northern allies. And this woman's biography, The Scenes of the Life of Harriet Tubman, is the biography on which almost every biography since has been based. Because Harriet Tubman never learned to read and write, by the way. And it is believed that it was because of that traumatic brain injury that not only caused the epileptic seizures, but caused, I guess we would call it brain fog, a lot of perhaps dyslexia, mental confusion, inability to concentrate, to really learn the words. She was very intelligent. She was so intelligent that she would schedule the departures when she was leading people to escape. She would schedule them to be on Saturday. Why? Because the newspaper wouldn't come out until Monday. So that gave her 1 day advance. So she was not an ignorant person who could not figure things out. But Bradford helped to capture her ideas, her thoughts, her words in so many ways. It's Bradford who told us the story, and then later on some of her interviews confirmed it, that she didn't let anybody turn around who she was leading to the escape routes. She always carried a pistol, defense, but also as a warning. There were people who got tired, scared, wanted to go back, and she was like, you're going to be free or you're going to be dead. Because dead men tell no tales. Because if you return, they would torture you until you sang like a canary. And she was not having it. And there were no people that we're aware of who turned back. And if they did, you know what happened to them. So why did she trust Bradford to tell her story? Probably had a lot to do with the fact that Bradford was in a position to get her story out there in a way that was big, that was tremendous, that would be helpful to the cause of after slavery was over. There was still a lot of work to do. The nation turned its back on helping enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, to settle as free people. It was the first time that America did that. You know, when America had servants, both servants without contracts and indentured servants, they didn't leave people to figure it out. They always gave them money or land. But that was not the case for people of African descent who were left to figure it out on themselves, all by themselves. So she wanted Bradford to help. She also made sure that prior to the end of the Civil War, she purchased a home in Auburn, New York. And you know, that's where Vivian Carter Mason, who was the third president of the National Council of Negro Women, who was born, or actually lived in Auburn. She and her husband, W.T. Mason Sr., lived in Norfolk, and she became an important administrator in the welfare department in New York, but she always had Norfolk as her home. And she told the story of how Harriet Tubman came to their house regularly. They were members of the same church. And she said she learned how to cook cornbread from Harriet Tubman as she regaled them with hair-raising stories of her escapes. That's when I really want a time machine, so I could go back, because she never recorded what some of those hair-raising escapes included, what were some of the details. But Tubman wasn't just involved in helping to free people from slavery. She was helping to free women from the chains of not being able to vote, not being able to hold positions in society. She was an advocate for the aged. She used her home and created a home for the aged. And that's actually where she died. She was a fierce supporter of people, especially the dispossessed, especially the vulnerable. And she never, ever, ever stopped fighting. This picture, and you see Harriet Tubman on the far left, you see that she was all about family. She did remarry. Her first husband, when she wanted to escape and did successfully, refused to go with her. And when she came back a couple of years later, she found out that he had remarried. And that broke her heart. She said some really tough things about him later on. But she would eventually remarry, married a much younger man. Interestingly, that's actually in keeping with Harriet Tubman, because she was someone that it was tough to keep up with her activities. And she made sure that her family was protected, cared for, and of course, busy with jobs. I wanted to give you, to really conclude with a few things about the people who were important in her life, like Wendell Phillips, who said, "The last time I ever saw John Brown was under my own roof, as he brought Harriet Tubman to me, saying, 'Mr. Phillips, I bring you one of the best and bravest persons on this continent, General Tubman, as we call her. In my opinion, there are few captains, perhaps few colonels, who have done more for the loyal course since the war began, and few men who did before that time more for the colored race than our fearless and most gracious friend, Harriet.'" Then you have Frederick Douglass, who wrote a letter to her in 1868. And I think this is such an important letter. He said, and this is just an excerpt, he said, "Most that I have done and suffered in the service of our cause has been in public, and I have received much encouragement at every step of the way. You, on the other hand, have labored in a private way. I have wrought in the day, you in the night. I have had the applause of the crowd and the satisfaction that comes of being approved by the multitude, while the most that you have done has been witnessed by a few trembling, scared, and foot-sore bondsmen and women whom you've led out of the house of bondage, and whose heartfelt "God bless you" has been your only reward. Excepting John Brown, I know of no one who has willingly encountered more perils and hardships to serve our enslaved people than you have." And then William Seward, who was the Secretary of State under Lincoln, said, "I have known her long, and a nobler, higher spirit, or truer, seldom dwells in human form." At the age of 98, and this is a picture just a short time before she died, and she still looks like a tough nut, is Harriet Tubman. And she was celebrated nationally. Well, I should say, except for in the South. But she was celebrated in the rest of the country for her work. And since that time, there were ships named after her. There were groups, organizations, scholarship funds and so forth named after her. But of course, in 2016, President Barack Obama was pushing to have her face replace Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. And she will be the first woman in over a century to be featured on one of our bills. But of course, during the Trump administration, he tried to sideline that seriously. And there was doubt that that would ever happen. But today we've had confirmation that in 2030, I don't know why it's so long from now, but in 2030, the bill featuring Harriet Tubman will finally be released. And so I want to end with one thing, and I think it's just such a, it was such a powerful message. And it is a song featured in Harriet Tubman's, in the film Harriet, called Stand Up. And it ends with the last words of Harriet Tubman.
Easy now. I'm gonna be free or die. I've been walking with my face turned to the sun. Weight on my shoulders, a bullet in my gun. Oh, I got eyes in the back of my head, just in case I have to run. I do what I can when I can, while I can for my people. While the clouds roll back and the stars fill the night, that's when I'm gonna stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home, far across the river. Can you hear freedom calling, calling me to answer? Gonna keep on keeping on. I can feel it in my bones.
You have made it 100 miles to freedom. Would you like to pick a new name to mark your freedom?
Harriet Tubman. Early in the morning, before the sun begins to shine, we're gonna start moving towards that separating line. I'm wading through muddy waters. You know I got a made up mind. And I don't mind if I lose any blood on the way to salvation. And I fight with the strength that I got until I die. So I'm gonna stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home, far across the river. You hear freedom calling, calling me to answer. Gonna keep on keeping on.
Harriet, welcome to the Underground Railroad.
And I know
The song ends with "I go to prepare a place for you." Those were the last words of Harriet Tubman. Thank you. And now I'm ready to take any questions.
In what year did the importation of slaves to the United States cease?
So it was, and I'll just repeat the question so you can have it on video. So the question was, in what year did the importation of enslaved people, and I'm assuming you're asking from the continent of Africa, when did that cease? So our Constitution of 1789 ruled that in 1808, America would stop participating officially in the transatlantic slave trade. So 1807 was officially the last year that enslaved people coming from the continent of Africa were brought here. But we know that with the Amistad and other situations, that there was a lot of contraband transportation. We also know that from the Caribbean, Cuba, Barbados, some from Jamaica and a few other places, they continued to be brought here into the country because that was not considered a transatlantic system. And then, of course, by 1820, we would start to see a very robust domestic slave trade happening inside of the country. Thank you for the question. Yes?
Yes, ma'am. Do you know if her family, up in New York, if they do any, historical events or anything?
Yes. Yes. Up in fact, is interesting that you asked that question. One of my aunts was married to one of the descendants. Their last name is Ross. And Harriet Tubman never had any children. She had nieces and nephews. And so it's from that broader family base that there are the descendants of Harriet Tubman. And they do celebrate, they talk about their history, they talk about what has happened since, they talk about, the family, and so they are very much involved in keeping that history alive. And then, of course, the National Park Service has preserved her home and has a lot of interpretive material out there about Harriet Tubman, not just the part of the Underground Railroad, but her early years as well as her later years. And they have the family very much participating in a lot of that.
I'm sorry. I'm going to have everyone with further questions speak into the magic microphone so that we can capture it in our taping. So,
I was asking the woman where I saw Davis behind her name.
I'm sorry?
I saw the name Davis
Uh-huh.
behind her name. I'm a Davis. I was wondering.
I don't know. Could be. Because she did have some sisters who were sold, so I'm afraid I can't tell you. She did remarry, but she didn't have any children. Yes. So that, could be relationship by marriage. Since Davis is a relatively common name, it all depends on where your family is from. Because African Americans, it is wrong to believe that African Americans did not have a last name during slavery. It's just that the slaveholders did not usually record the last name, but they passed on the last name. And typically, the females would take the last name, typically, not always, typically they would take the last name of their mother if their mother kept their family's last name, and the boys would take on the last name of their fathers. Because what that did was it took you to where that family originated in this country. So there was a plantation or a space in which the family originated, and they wanted to keep that history alive with that name. And in the case of Harriet Tubman, she actually kept the name, her mother kept or adopted the name Ross, and so she kept the name Ross and actually continued, using it until her name became so popular that people knew the Tubman more than they did the Ross.
Is Fort Monroe the closest she ever got to here?
Yes, as far as we know. She was there twice. Once about 1861 at the beginning of the war when thousands of freedom seekers fled to the fort, and when they were creating a hospital there, she was there at that time, and that's where she talked about the flies and how horrible the conditions were. And then she was brought back at the end of the war in 1865 as a matron, the matron nurse for the hospital. She wanted to stay, but they didn't pay her much money, and she was trying to make sure that she provided enough money for her family. So she was only there for a few months. You're welcome.
Where are William Still's papers?
They are in the, you can find some of them online. The library, the Library Company of Pennsylvania, they're the ones in Philadelphia, they're the ones who have the papers. Fortunately, William Still's son, after William Still died, did not do what a lot of kids do. They throw away everything other than money that their parents have. He didn't do that. He boxed up, and there were tons of boxes, he boxed up all of his father's papers and gave them to that library to preserve. Unfortunately, they just threw the boxes in the corner and forgot about it until they moved the library, and then they found this treasure trove of boxes, and it is like the core of their collection now. But
Really, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania?
no, it is the Library Company of Philadelphia. Sorry, I said Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. Right, and so you can go in and you don't have to pay a fee to go in and use their materials, but you can actually go online and just type in Journal C, William Still, and you can find all of that. In addition to his book, The Underground Railroad, all of that is accessible online as well.
All right, we just got 2 more questions left here, and then we're going to wrap it up, and there'll be a book signing and a gift shop right after.
I have a statement more than a question. So good to have you back again, sharing with us. We were with Dr. Knight at IC Norfolk High School, and we were blessed to have taken a group of Norfolk students to Harriet Tubman's home up in upstate New York, and had an opportunity to meet her great niece. I don't know how many greats are in there, but she shared a lot of information with the students at Norfolk about all that Harriet had done during her lifetime. And also, my mother is from Beaufort, South Carolina, where I spent all my summers. And there at Tabernacle Baptist Church, they are erecting a monument for the time that she spent in the Beaufort, South Carolina area. So thank you so very much for sharing.
Thank you for sharing that as well.
And also, in the gift shop, we'll have the raffle drawing for all of you who... Oh, we're going to do it here, I'm sorry. So hold tight.
Dr. Cassandra, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Many of the folks in the audience do not know I'm Shannon Glover, the mayor of Portsmouth, Virginia. This is my wife, Paula, and Dr. Cassandra was my history teacher. So I'm always educated when she shows up. One of the questions that, and I know this is not about Harriet necessarily, but I would like you to add some content to it. During the Civil War, as you're aware, you mentioned the 54th Regiment and also Harriet's involvement as a spy working on the side of the North. I know that Abraham Lincoln wasn't really excited about allowing for black men to enter the war effort. And I know that Douglas really kind of pressured him into making that happen. But I do also know that it was not just the pressure, it was a reality for Lincoln.
Yes.
Because at the end of the day, the North was getting their brains beat out, and they needed an infusion of men. And Douglas always told him, he said, give us the opportunity to fight for our freedom. And so can you just quickly elaborate on the impact? Because a lot of people don't understand that African Americans played a very pivotal role in the North winning that war. And if we were not involved in that particular conflict to the degree we were, we could very well have a different history lesson here today. So could you elaborate on that?
I think you said pretty much all. I'll just add this one piece. When we talk about one of the final battles of the Civil War here in Virginia, takedown of Richmond, we don't talk about the Battle of Newmarket Heights, where at least 6 African American men were awarded the Medal of Honor. Ironically, the Army preferred to give them the Medal of Honor than to give them officer status. But these men sacrificed tremendously, and that battle was the turning point that opened the door for the troops to march into Richmond. Why is it we don't talk about that? Because once again, history has been written by people who have been erasing the contributions, the activities of African Americans in our narrative. And a lot of that came from Jim Crow. A lot of that came from this idea that America, and it wasn't something that was stated early on, it came a little bit later, but that America is just for white people. And that's why you have some people telling black people to go back to Africa. Yeah, I'm old enough that people said that to me, and I said, you first. And, so if we're going anywhere, you got to go too. And so the idea that African Americans served in the war, and even before the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by Lincoln that allowed for the creation of the United States Colored Troops, there were black men serving on naval ships. During the Ironclad Battle, you had African American men who were on the USS Monitor. You had African American men who were already serving in these units, but they were seen as contraband units. But they would send them to actually secure plantations and to pull all of the enslaved people off those plantations. So that started happening in 1862. But even in 1861, the first thing that the Confederacy did after the war began, the first thing before they drafted a single white man into uniform, they drafted African American men to build fortifications. And so our history has been so skewed that we don't even know about our past. But a lot of that skewing happened in the 20th century because we had a purpose, and that was to create a system of discrimination that we call Jim Crow. And you can't get people to comply if you believe they're contributors. With that, I thank you all.
One more thing. I'd like to know what you think about the celebration of Black History Month. It's something that we continue to do. Could you just give me your views on?
I think that as long as we have jacked up standards of learning, as long as we have denial, as long as we teach a history that is not true, or that is pared down, watered down to make people feel comfortable. History doesn't make you feel comfortable. Do family genealogy and come back and tell me you feel comfortable. It's not designed to make you feel comfortable. It's designed to educate you, to inform you. Because whether or not you like your ancestors pass things down. The good, the bad, and the ugly. They pass it down to you. And it's better to be informed than ignorant of it. And so history is similar to that. What Black History Month does is it kicks off a theme through which you can learn about our past that has been erased. And when I say our past, I don't mean just African Americans' past. I mean our nation's past. It allows you to look at that, and they provide you with a wealth of material to help educate yourself, your children, your community. And that education is supposed to go on for the rest of the year until the next month. And so I'm a supporter of that because we have not yet gotten to the point where it's unnecessary.
Wow, what a powerful presentation. Thank you so much, and I'm not going to get out of your way here. So we do have a couple of copies we'd like to raffle off. Virginia Waterways and the Underground Railroad, which you can have autographed by Cassandra Newby-Alexander, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. The mayor's probably had to read this already for class. So if we pull your name, we might substitute you. Do you? Okay, fantastic. So if you want to pull, your names are in here for everyone who registered, and you can come on up afterwards and pick up the names. Is it?
Oh, it's folded. I was wondering. Yao Lawrence.
All right. And then one more. Got one more.
Steve Greaves.
All right. Well, thank you all again. Thank you, Dr. Newby-Alexander. We will do the autograph signing, book signing up front. And then please join us for our next presentation on February 18th, which also has the reception and exhibit opening as well. Thank you again.